Today's episode is brought to you by Musical Surroundings. For over 30 years, Musical Surroundings has distributed high-performance analog playback equipment to vinyl enthusiasts and music lovers throughout the United States. Based in Oakland, California, Musical Surroundings represents world-class brands like Clear Audio, Hanna, DS Audio, and their own line of Musical Surroundings phono preamplifiers. To learn more about the exceptional turntables, cartridges, and analog accessories they offer, visit musicalsurroundings.com. That's musicalsurroundings.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by one of the originals in high-end audio, Purist Audio Designs. Purist Audio Design made the first fluid-shielded audio cable over 35 years ago and still makes them today right here in the U.S. For over 35 years, Purist Audio has connected you to the music. They passionately make high-end, high-crafted audio cables designed specifically to the needs of your system. They list their specs, such as resistance and shield quality, and you can find them at PURISTAUDIODESIGN.com. Purist Audio Designed is veteran-owned and available worldwide. Today's episode is also sponsored by SCHIIT Audio. SCHIIT Audio designs and builds audio components in California and Texas. Based in Valencia and Corpus Christi, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit SCHIIT.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's SCHIIT.com. Welcome, friends. This is indeed the first episode of Season 6 of the Occasional Podcast. Today's show is a view from the booth, reference systems, accuracy, and why audiophiles love jazz so much. In this particular context, we're talking about the recording booth, of course, and our mastering engineer, Dave McNair from McNair Mastering, and production guru, Grover Neville, join us on the show to discuss a really, this has got to be one of the most interesting conversations we've had in a while on the show. It's quite fascinating to kind of hear from their perspective, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But first, I did want to mention, if you like our show, if you get something from the show, please visit our advertisers. They keep us going. They help support the show and make sure we can produce a new episode for you guys every other week. So if you like what you hear, check out those advertisers. Check them out. Their support has been invaluable this year. This week's show is about a lot of different things. In addition to the idea of clean versus colored, which we explore, and that is really kind of an exploration of the idea of clean and musical, like the top performing, clean sounding, reference style sound that you hear in the studios occasionally in different scenarios, plus colored, things that sound just fantastic, and you don't even have to be sure if they're completely flat or this type of true reference thing. They just sound good. So these guys both sit on both sides of the fence, and they offer a really interesting window into kind of what and how we can think about different ways and really give a lot of insight on the backside of how it's produced from the other side. So why audiophiles love jazz so much. I also want to mention that the audio shows are trying to get fired up again. So we're a big supporter of the audio show circuit here on the show. We love to go to the shows, meet with you guys in person, hear all the good stuff. It looks like Rocky Mountain, Expona, and the Florida show are all still on. There's actually a headphone show next month in September called Can Jam SoCal 2021. That's Saturday and Sunday, September 25 to 26. Coming up, that's probably the soonest one, I think. Hopefully, with COVID, none of that gets shut down. It's still up in the air a little bit, but this one is full steam ahead, according to the show organizers. And, of course, you can check out their website to make sure of any updates to that. But that's the first show we're going to be attending, which I'm very excited for. A little headphone action. But then again, after that, Rocky Mountain, Expona, and Florida show next year in February. So we're looking forward to all of that kind of getting fired up again, and we'll try to do our best to attend those shows. Also, I want to remind you guys The PTA network that we're a part of is up and running. Reviews on parttimeaudiophile.com, the website. Also, audiohead.com. They have the buying guide on PTA, the best of, some big references for you guys to check out right there on the homepage of the website at parttimeaudiophile.com. And I think that about covers it for the intro this time. I'm going to leave it up to Dave and Grover to kind of take you on a little audiophile production adventure. So on with the show. Here we go. Take it away, guys. Today's show is also sponsored by Wharfedale. For nearly 90 years, Wharfedale has built loudspeakers for music lovers all over the world. With a warm and natural sound signature, their inherently high-fidelity sonic retrieval simply makes you want to listen to your music for longer. Visit WHARFEDALEUSAdotCOM to discover the high-value Diamond 12 series, the best-selling Linton Heritage, and the no-holds-barred Elysian. That's WHARFEDALEUSA.com. So we're here with a very special opinion piece or a think piece from two of my favorite guys, Grover Neville and Dave McNair of McNair Mastering. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about some very interesting things in our war room chat room for Part-Time Audiophile. And this particular subject came up between you two guys.
Yeah, so as I recall, Dave, we'd been talking about super high-end gear that really kind of, the term endgame gets used by a lot of audiophiles or summit fire, whatever you want to call it. Specifically, you know, the Acoras that you had in, the Tidal preamp, the VAC, some of the high-end VAC gear, and then also our experiences mutually with Wilson Audio and other like uber high-end gear like that.
Right.
And you said something really interesting. Correct me if I'm misremembering this, but it was something along the lines of like the super high-end gear like that does this thing where it's not really imposing a super identifiable musical signature on things, which is kind of an interesting take because my take on hi-fi has been there's not a lot of difference between what happens in the pro, like in a really well-treated, you know, well-set-up studio and a hi-fi setup, other than they have slightly different aims, and the hi-fi setup generally I want to be colored in a certain way.
Right.
So like what's the place of like gear like that that's like it's incredibly musically enjoyable, but like how do we describe is it colored? What's the coloration? Like how does that fit into our sort of like ethos around hi-fi?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe this discussion came up in part because I was kind of re-examining my feelings about that, because my general feelings were like, you know, a really well done pro mixing room or mastering room. It's super accurate, and you can hear everything you need to do to get work done. But in some ways, it's maybe not what you want to just sit down and kind of lose yourself into listening. And so if I had a pretty good system at home, even if it wasn't accurate, but it had a set of colorations that I thought were cool, it was always fun to like play something at home that I'd worked on, because it invariably just kind of sounded better and felt better. And it wasn't because it was more accurate, but maybe less accurate. And then as time has gone on, the past year and a half, and I've gotten much more, you know, low coloration, super kind of more accurate stuff at home, that once I kind of got over a certain psychological hump, I getting more enjoyment from listening to that than stuff that leans more kind of pleasing coloration. But it turns out that the stuff that's like super, super clean that is very enjoyable to listen to is a much smaller subset of just this, you know.
I almost think of gear in terms of not just the colorations, like frequency response or sort of harmonic distortion or any of that kind of stuff, but also in terms of how all of the weird little technical pieces of it come together to present an engagement or an immersion factor. And you've heard this, Dave, right? Like old classic 50s and 40s, like really rare specific pieces of gear throughout the audio ages has this immersion factor that makes you forget about frequency response, forget about like any of those other things we typically think of. and it has this invisible, hard to determine immersion factor. And usually with old tube gear, it's like, if you were to say, is it flat, you would know that it's not.
Right.
But something about the newer high-end gear that's really like that those Tidal electronics, yeah, it's flat, but it has a little bit of that, like, it's not in the same way, but it has a little bit of that, like, wow, it's super hyper clean, but it's not. Sometimes the studio gear can be unflattering to the signal in a way that is informative, but not enjoyable. And there's an elusive, like, flat, but also flattering to the signal in a certain way. And it's like, I don't know if it's coloration or if it's more accuracy or if that immersion quality is even separate from any of that other stuff. Well, but it's fascinating.
I was scrolling on Instagram the other day and I was looking to this like vintage Japanese hi-fi kind of curated thing, and it's all these like articles from these. And, you know, you look at these and they're each profiling a system. And, you know, there's like these crazy, like Western Electric horns and tube this and that.
Filling,
And not too many years ago, I would have looked at it and said, well, that probably sounds like ass, you know. And now I look at it and go, you know, there's a pretty good chance that would be a mind-blowing system, not in total linearity and stuff like that, but just in some gestalt way that era of gear can communicate something about a recording. I mean, that's a weird subclassification on its own because it's trying not to have any kind of pleasing colorations or anything, but it was just what the tech could accomplish in, you know, 1951 or something, or, you know, and then 1958 or something.
And it's a little harder. It was a little harder back then also to make gear that performed at any sort of acceptable level because, you know, not to get too deep into design or measurements jargon, but you didn't have the sophistication of tools that we have now where you can look at a scope and you can put an IC chip in it and you can say, all right, well, the THD is low and the frequency response is flat. And, you know, back then it was like, you know, they were just developing feedback and developing, you know, they were developing the techniques we have now. And so there was some EMI engineer, I think it was EMI or maybe RCA, and it's a kind of famous quote where the engineer said, if it sounds bad and measures good, or if it sounds good and measures poorly, you're measuring the wrong thing.
Right.
And, you know, some of those guys back then had like, it was like, there are things that you look at and you're like, that's maybe wrong or it shouldn't work, but it does sound really good. And like you said, that old classic gear, they had to kind of feel things out a little bit more and use their ears. And to a certain degree, you know, simple stuff. Like I think one of the first amps that Western Electric ever made was literally transformer, pair of push-pull 2A3s, and then transformer output. That's the whole amp.
Right.
It's just transformer, tubes, transformer, and that's it. That's the whole circuit.
I mean, I think we went through the kind of the 70s era where circuits were really complex and they were trying to solve things with, you know, brute force and things like that. And the thing now that you find is a lot of these like really amazing sounding hi-fi pieces are incredibly simple. And it's hard to, it's not, it seems like, well, that's the intuitive thing to do, but it has its own design challenges as well, you know, to be in the real world. Like, how are we going to get around having a volume control when this conventional volume control is not really, it's really kind of messing up the circuit, you know? So.
Yeah. Part selection becomes really important, and you need someone who's maybe a little bit unhinged at the top, like who has a crazy vision, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't, when you're paying attention to such minutia, you've got to. It's too easy to get lost in the woods.
Yeah. Well, you know, like one of the things that the new, for a long time everything was single-ended, it's all RCAs, and only Pro Audio had balanced connections. And there was a tendency for me to think, oh, well, that single-ended RCA stuff is kind of, that's the Bush League. You know, you really got to do it with balanced if you want the real deal. And then slowly over the years, the high-end home hi-fi stuff, they've started to incorporate the balance thing. And, you know, you find out when you sort of dig deeper and deeper that there's a lot to be said for a single-ended circuit. And you might have problems if you want to do long runs of the wire, but if everything is short connections or even better, an integrated amp where it's all in one box. In some like really heavily tech-driven and ear-driven pro mastering studios, is the West Coast guys have traditionally tried to figure out how to have their entire rig single-ended. And the East Coast guys, because of the population density and RF and microwave, they're like, nah, you just got to do it balanced, or else you're going to be in a world of noise. And I'm kind of heading toward setting up my whole mastering rig unbalanced, because I got this new EQ, and it just sounds amazing. It's got 2 modes, and you can run it either with a buffered balanced output or not, and the unbalanced is so superior sounding. So, and I also removed 2 different gain stages in my mastering console. So just removing multiple, and in the past I thought extremely transparent, but nonetheless, when I got them out of the circuit, it's like, okay, things are just way better sounding.
Yeah, there's something to a single-ended circuit. As one of our friends likes to say, it's faster.
Yeah.
Most Pro gear isn't actually dual path balanced. It's got transformers, and then the internal circuitry is oftentimes single-ended, actually. And that's an interesting kind of whole other thing that, studios have all this transformer coupling. So, of course, you've got the sound of the transformers. But on the other hand, there's a lot of audiophiles who actually have poorly impedance-matched systems and could either use better coupling or more transformers or something like that in their system. And so it's this interesting game where sometimes you hear a studio or an audiophile system, and it's like, oh, man, something's not working here, or wow, this is amazing. And it's just this weird, it's like, how can 3 boxes or 2 boxes and like 30 boxes both have, these similar kinds of issues or strengths? It's kind of fascinating that they can equate at all.
Most modern Pro gear, it's not transformer balanced. It's a chip. It's a
IC chip.
IC,
op amp.
Balanced op amp. So, and if you don't have to have a long run, you just you figure out how to modify the gear to just blow that off, and because a lot of pro gear, unlike home hi-fi, it doesn't give you dual, like, okay, you can run it single-ended or you can use it. It's just like, here's the ins and outs, they're balanced, but the entire thing on the inside is all single-ended. So you're like paying for more coloration just for ease of hooking things together. So
yeah, it's true. Going back a little bit to the original point about that super high-end transparent gear, I'm wondering, because you've started to incorporate, I mean, you're mastering in your living room at the moment.
Yeah.
What we think of traditionally as hi-fi speakers.
Yeah, and they sound
What's
great.
that been like?
It's been amazing, because I'm remodeling my garage, which I've had the studio in for a couple of years, but I'm going to take it a step further and make it better sounding and more comfortable and stuff. So I had to bring some of the gear inside, and I knew from doing a lot of critical listening and reviewing stuff in the living room that my living room was not, massively too colored or off acoustically, that it wouldn't, work. I've been living off and on with the larger chorus speakers. And it's funny, because I went back and reread my original review from like a year ago, and I said somewhere in there, I bet these would make great mastering speakers. And it turns out that they actually make really good mastering speakers. I had to do some more acoustical treatment in the living room, which I never really wanted to do, because I didn't want to garbage up the living room. But I put in a ceiling cloud, and I put a whole bunch of rock wool, and I stuffed the fireplace and did a bunch of stuff like that, and had some panels in some critical spots. I mean, it sounds amazing. I have a little bump at 100 hertz, which is clearer now. It's more delineated. Before, I couldn't really tell what was going on. Now I can really clearly hear that little 100. So I'm careful not to chop too much 100 if it feels like it's hot. Other than that, I mean, I can hear. I don't think in any room I've worked in is clearly hear a half dB EQ change, as in this room now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Wow.
So, and also the imaging thing was not something that I really dealt with much before. It's like, well, if the signal sounds, if it's really kind of mono-y, and they didn't spread stuff, but it feels like it would really feel better to spread a little bit. I might widen it a hair or two, but the systems in the past couple studios were not really geared toward like this imaging specific, kind of thing. And the Akora is imaged so well in my room too that if it's not doing that kind of cool 3-dimensional thing, I'm looking to make it sort of do more of that, So, yeah.
That, for me, the imaging is often wrapped up in that sense of like immersive, fast, very immediate, like that specialness that really, really amazing gear has. And I think it was you. We talked once about like sometimes with popular mainstream recordings that, center, left, right. But certain speakers make them fill in stuff in the sides between that in a certain way.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of theories about why that is. But do you feel like now that you're getting some more of that 3D holographic thing, do you feel like it's more transparent, or do you feel like it's an illusion that's just done better, or how do you feel about it?
It doesn't feel like a trick. It feels like somehow, I don't know, whatever it is, the geometry of the cabinet, the phase linearity, the components, something about the entire thing is giving me where I'm sitting at the listening spot, and also a substantially decreased secondary arrival reflection. The room doesn't sound, it's not really dead now, but it's substantially less ambient than it was. In fact, I even have a screen stopping the sound from going in the dining room and coming back out and giving a very subtle sense of a longer, decay time. It's not like sitting in the room I was in at Sterling or Masterdisc where it's like really dead and very strategically diffused. It still sounds more like a more natural living room kind of space, but the speakers are not like making just something in the middle of the imaging curve sound unusually wide or large or something like that. But when it is that way, or when I decide to kind of manipulate it subtly to be that way, it gives that information to me in a more dramatic way. Like it really tells me what's going on. And it's a combination of the room and the speakers. But I mean, I've had a lot of other speakers in that room that don't quite do that super arc of disappearingness that the SRC2s do in that room. So, yeah.
And we've kind of talked about how like you've come back into the audiophile fold after a break, and now it's like you're at the top. What's next?
Well, no, I wouldn't say I'm at the top. I'm having more fun mastering because I really like how it sounds in the living room, and honestly, I'm not scared, but I have a high bar now. Like I need to make the garage sound that good. So I'm going to spend a lot of time with treatment and a lot of time with bass control, and I'm going to put the Acoras in the garage, hold on to them and put them out there. It's kind of weird to think I've been doing it for so long, and I've actually been having more fun the past couple months than I can even remember, because I got this new EQ by this guy, Terry Audio, which is blowing my mind. But I also simplified the rig, so like I don't have 100 pieces to make me think I'm cool. I just have a hand, just a few things, and it's kind of going more minimalist. And I think that the minimal thing has been informed by listening to a lot of this extremely high quality hi-fi stuff, the VAC stuff, the Tidal stuff, the where they're approaching things in as simple as possible and careful circuit, careful parts. So yeah, the two things have been kind of, I didn't realize, a year and a half ago when I decided to review stuff that I didn't realize the two would kind of spill together, but it's been kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. So
yeah, sort of coherent audio journey. That's one thing I feel has always been interesting to me, is that there's a lot of studios where when you're auditioning a piece of pro audio gear, for example, the differences are often less subtle than with audiophile gear. You turn a knob on an EQ, or you crank an input on a compressor, and you get a relatively more audible effect than putting a new preamp or a new DAC into a system, right? But most pro audio systems, most studios aren't transparent enough to tell you about the differences that a a traditional audiophile system would make. Because like you said, typically I used to think of like, I want my hi-fi system to be colored in a specific way, and I want my pro system to not really flatter the signal.
Or at the very least, you want your home system to have some increased sense of kind of resolution and detail.
Yeah.
That whether that's the reality or not is not important. In the production end of it, you don't necessarily. I used to think, I don't want gobs of all of that friggin' detail because it's too distracting. I'll paint on a more limited canvas, and then I'll view the painting in this other environment where I can just see every little... And now I'm enjoying working in a super highly resolved, super detailed system, and I never thought that, I didn't think those two worlds
that could be
would meet.
overwhelming. That could be overwhelming for a less experienced engineer, though, potentially, because
I wouldn't want to mix. I wouldn't want to mix on the chorus.
Right.
I mean, mastering.
You could very easily get into too many weeds messing with little things.
I still would rather mix on a much lower resolution system because it forces you to look at the bigger picture.
I find that really, really interesting that you say that, because I've often wondered, not having as much production background as you two, if people are involved in viewing all that detail that you describe, or if it's just something that's inherently there, and just because you didn't view it or hear something little in the background doesn't mean that it included when you can decode it later. So even it's like taking a photo, right? You could take a photo and it has a super high resolution, but if you only view it on a low res screen, you're still seeing the photo. You can work with the photo, but when you export it, also high res, that detail, like a nugget in the background somewhere that was super small, it's there. Even though when I adjusted it, or the mastering engineer works with it, or the mixing guy mixes, they're not like in all that detail, but you still manipulate it, and it's still there at the end. Because I think that part of the misconception about detail with these systems is that people don't know what they're missing, but it's still there. I think some people argue, well, if I can't hear it, that it doesn't exist. But I would say there is detail like layered into recordings that's not always audible that can come out with high fidelity systems.
Usually, if the engineer can't touch it, it's going to stay intact.
Well, the thing that you got to realize is that it's certainly on a non-classical or non traditional jazz or whatever, but any kind of pop, rock, rootsy, Americana, any kind of production like that that's been recorded and mixed, the mixing engineer, he wants you to hear every little fucking thing that they have recorded and put in there. Now, he knows inherently you can't give every single thing the same weight. Certain elements need to be more featured than others, but they don't intentionally hide little things. Like sometimes there's masking going on where certain frequencies will happen at the same time that make it a little bit harder to hear what's going on. And the guys that are truly the amazing mix engineers can flip into a listening where they can make themselves kind of intuitively forget what all the little sounds are. Because when you know what's there, you will hear it when you're mixing it. And you may not feature it very prominently. You're like, oh yeah, that little sound there, we don't need to hear that much of that, But for the average person, they'll never hear that sound because it's so buried. But the mixer guy, we spent hours recording that sound. I know it's there. I just don't need to hear it very much. And in a sense, a super high-res, low coloration, low distortion system that allows you to hear those little things easier is cool, but you could hear everything that the mixer put in there on a table radio or on the factory system in a 69 Super Beetle. It's there for you to hear. And once you hear it on the high-res system, you'll hear it on the low-res system, any other.
I like that point. Yeah.
It also kind of brings up the point of what is detail, because I think a lot of audiophiles tend to assume that detail is just, lower distortion and more information. But sometimes, as you noted, Dave, there's masking and stuff like that. And detail is this weird combination of like the texture of sounds and how little or how much is going on at any particular time in the song, the relative frequencies being, either crowded or not crowded, the micro dynamic contrast, and our perception of whether there's a contrast between the loud and soft sounds at a small level and at a big level. And all those, and then of course, harmonic structure and all these other little saturation, other things like that. But that texture is really important because one of the reasons that audiophiles love the kind of like Diana Krall, like, vocals with, really close mic female vocals that are very breathy with not a lot of tone and just light instrumentations that's kind of hard panned out is because with that kind of music, nothing is ever really in the same position. Nothing is in the same frequency range.
Nothing's
and it's all
masked.
ultra raw and bare.
Yeah.
And you hear every little texture, even the stuff that normal engineers would be like, that's super
It's impossible
ugly.
not to hear every little tiny thing.
Yeah. And sometimes having all that texture is not appropriate for a song. Like sometimes you want the song to be smooth and to be polished sounding and not have a ton of texture. Or sometimes you want it to be different at different points in an album or a song. And so the mix engineer's job is also to kind of strategically make some taste, and the producer too, make some taste-oriented decisions around that. And not all music actually needs to be hyper detailed. Like if you heard a smooth jazz recording and you could hear Kenny G's buttons clicking and the breathing and
exactly.
it would be like super distracting. It's like, no, this is supposed to be like really relaxing, smooth.
Yeah.
That would be inappropriate.
Well, this from music production and from mixing, but one of the things that skilled mixers do is that when you're trying to figure the placement of things, especially if you have a pretty dense production or a production that at times gets dense, it's not just panning and level, it's kind of how high res you want to make it. So you can, if you have a part that kind of needs to be featured, let's say it's some kind of core, piano part, and it kind of anchors things, but it's going to run through most of the tune. And other elements are going to come in and out, counter melodies and things like that. The surefire way to make it harder to do that is to make your core piano part super high res detailed, because then everything else has to compete with that. So you make that kind of lower res so that the color of that is less saturated, and so anything else doesn't have to be, even if it's a little bit more colorful and a little bit more saturated, then it doesn't have to be that much louder to stand out and do the thing. So the focus that's employed by really great mixers to juggle putting all these things together so it's a musical whole, but so that you can hear what you need, what they want you to hear, but not be distracted by other. It's a genius. The guys that do it well are just geniuses. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It requires this weird combination of like technical skill, taste, and creative sort of intuition. That's the only word I can think of it. There's like a creative intuition I've seen with people like Bob Clearmountain.
And it's why I like listening to those kind of recordings more than Diana Krall, because to me, I don't have anything against that, but like that's basically the easiest thing to do. You get 4 people to play, you record them super high res, and bang, you're done. It's like there's nothing to it.
Yeah.
All the elements in Diana Krall are going to have equal super high res. That's one of the things about those old bebop recordings that's kind of cool, is that just because the way the cards fell that day or whatever the thing was, you find on so many of those blue notes that the sax or whoever's the lead wind instrument will be like super high res and in your face. And the piano sounds like it was a broken mic. It's like it didn't have a shred over 5K. It's like the piano just sounds like this. Okay, well that's kind of cool, but I don't really revere a lot of those old bebop recordings as like these hi-fi spectaculars, because they're not. They're just a weird mishmash of
it's like, we recorded the piano in a bathroom down the street on Friday, and the sax was in Capitol Records main studio on Monday.
We had to put a couple of EVRE 18s or something in here because the piano's kind of near the drums. We don't want the cymbals. Like, it's always a practical thing necessarily, other than, I'm going to make the audiophiles love this. Nobody cares about that.
We're not the first and foremost in all you guys' mind on the production side.
Like the last. And the other thing too is it's kind of hard to do that kind of like ultra audiophile-y type of recording with an ensemble that plays in a single room for anything other than like a violin quartet or a like small chamber classical ensembles. Even large orchestra recordings are usually pieced together a bit from multiple takes and multiple mic positions, and like, hey, we want to have the horns play just this because it sounded good, but the whole orchestra wasn't quite in tune for the B section or whatever. Like almost nothing other than chamber classical and maybe like some bluegrass is actually like played live. Some jazz too, not all, but some of it is played live.
I addressed this topic in another conceptual piece that will be in PTA pretty soon, called "Reality is Overrated," and it's it's about why all recordings, so few fulfill this kind of this pie in the sky audiophile. Like, well, why can't they sound like? Why can't they all just go in a room and play live and make it sound so that if I've got this uber high end system, I've got this credible approximation of being there, when it happened. Like, why can't they do that? Why do they have to make it sound? And I go into that in detail. Yeah. So
it's kind of like if you took an old film camera and you took a bunch of photos and people were looking at the negatives being like, oh, this is so pure and crisp and untainted by developing and photo editing. And you're like, it's just film. You can't see anything. It's all just raw material.
It's also like, well, the purest way to experience this scene in the film is to have this just medium shot, and it never changes.
Yeah.
And you're there, and you're witnessing the three people talk. Well, okay, that's cool for a minute, but give me some close-ups. Like, I need something beyond reality.
Give me some pan shots.
Give me some pan shots.
Yeah, exactly.
The Diana Krall recordings, not that we're picking on her, but they're the audio equivalent of just a documentary, a medium shot, and we're not going to have any cameras moving or close-ups or anything.
And in a sense, I suppose that kind of puts it in perspective, right? Like the really super resolving audio gear that we talked about at the beginning. That's kind of more the reality. The reality's in the gear, almost more than it is in the recordings, right?
Right. Yeah.
In the way that it conveys.
I've had a big change in heart in recent months about my feelings about playing anything on super high-res rigs. Have you ever felt like a system that you had sounded incredible on like 20% of the stuff, and the other stuff you just like, I just don't want to listen to that anymore because my system is making it sound too weird?
Oh, absolutely. There was some speakers I owned in college that were old center channels I used as bookshelves. And for what I had at the time, they're really nice. But they had a little brightness at like 6K and at 7K. There was like a couple little peaks up in the treble. And it made like certain kinds of like electronic dance music just unlistenable. It was just like awful. I mean, you could not, if I had friends over, we would never play, and we wanted to like blast some EDM just to be, hooligans. We would never play them on those speakers. We would just grab some Bluetooth speaker and some little, because it was like, yes, it was at a better bass and it filled the room more and did all this other stuff great. But it was like those two, it was like that little, some metallic-y quality and the little treble peak. It just made it so unpleasant to listen to for that genre. And I think, you've had some experience recently, some speakers that aim to be very analytical. For me, it's hard to find a system that plays everything well, but I do still kind of have this notion that there are systems that can play everything with some sense that there is, I don't know whether you want to use the word accuracy, but enjoyability. Yeah.
I'm coming to that, actually.
And that's what
I think that does exist. I think a lot of it's kind of in the psychology of the listener, but I think that the more time goes on, the more I hear more stuff, and the more I put together different systems for review purposes, the more I'm hearing, you can definitely kind of curate your system to skew toward the kind of stuff that you like and make that sort of stuff sound better. But if you're like me and you listen to a super wide variety of stuff, and not just genres, but different time periods and different recording techniques and all that.
Yeah.
I think the best way to approach that is actually the absolute lowest coloration, flattest. In other words, in some sense, the most boring kind of ultra revealing, ultra high res, but yet it can't be even minutely too bright. It can't, it has to be like really,
it has to be right on the edge of the knife. And you can find those high res systems, but they are rare.
They're rare,
and they're hard to set up. You have to have a good room, good speakers, good taste in electronics. when you are aiming to have a system that has no colorations, you need to have pretty sophisticated ears to be able to tell what is going on that is low coloration, right? Because like I think there's some brands that I know of that, you know, personally I listen to them and I'm like, I don't think audiophiles really know what accurate or the impression of accurate is, because these sound super dry and not involving at all. But to me, that's a coloration in itself, right?
Right.
And that's a perspective rather on the music that I don't think, like, I think most music that I like listening to at least should be involving, or it should be presented in a way that it's listenable, you know, because like you, I've heard those super high resolution systems like, wow, this is amazingly detailed, and yeah, this is a shitty recording, but I still am having a ton of fun.
Yes.
And that's possible.
Yeah, I know. That's the brass ring right there. And it can be some weird-ass Western electric horn thing with, it doesn't have to necessarily be some brand new, super high-tech, modern thing. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a specialist in vintage, so I don't know. But you know,
there is some vintage stuff where it's like there may be flaws in it, but I've heard some stuff from the 30s and 40s, even speakers, but especially electronics, where it was like there may be one or two flaws in it that are so carefully managed that they're essentially non-issues, and otherwise it is like, again, it might not be as detailed or as resolving, or it might not be as highfalutin in the treble, like as grainless in the treble, but like there is that unbelievable sense of refinement and immersion that you can get from old gear. So I don't think it's necessarily a secret of, is it possible to do? I think it's just, do you have someone who knows and who's spent the time and who has the creative kind of insane genius? And I also think, I've been thinking a lot lately about how humans hear a lot more similarly than differently, right? That our ear... So our ear has this property called autoacoustic emissions. Our ear is sending out little it actually generates signals, right? So it generates all these little signals, and it uses those to EQ and compress and comb filter, and our ear is constantly processing all the audio around us. And the weird thing is our brain builds us an EQ profile to compensate for all these things that we hear. And the fact that you or I or Brian or most of the people that we know can walk into a room and we can hear a pair of speakers, and like I would say 95% of the time we'll walk out and be like, those were awesome, and we'll all agree. Or like, man, those didn't really do it for me, and we'll all agree. Like, how is it possible? Different ages, different ethnicities, different genders, different everything. And we're all like, yeah, we can kind of agree. And even if our preferences are different, we can agree on the sound of the speaker. Like our ears across major divisions in human diversity are able to build a fairly similar target response, a fairly similar target, process. And I think part of it is just because humans at a certain level are not at that anatomically different. Like a tiger or a dog is more anatomically different than a human to another human, right?
Yeah.
But it is amazing that I think most humans hear more similarly than different.
I would agree.
To me,
I would totally agree.
That's some indication that there is, I don't want to say a totally universal truth to audio, but that there is some core truth to the super high resolution systems that do it.
Absolutely.
Well.
And I would further piggyback on that to say that the first time that kind of conceptually occurred to me was many years ago in music production. And I had my idea of what it should sound like. And I'm recording, I'm mixing away. The band comes in and hears it. And in the early years, like one guy in the band would be like, yeah, that's cool. The other guys are kind of scratching their head or like, I don't know, whatever. And then as time goes on and I get kind of better at it, or I'm around another mixer who's really good and they're doing their thing and the band comes in and everybody goes, that's it. And there's a band full of guys that have different tastes and stuff. They hear differently. And they're like, or everybody's in the room. They're going like, something is not, turn the reverb down on the vocal. And everybody goes, that's it. The window of acceptability is not as wide as you might think, even across different genres and styles and stuff. It's really weird. There's just this, it's not super narrow, but the sweet spot of what everybody thinks is cool is not as broad as we might think.
It's kind of why, if you've ever heard experimental music, funny bleeps and skronks and people scratching weird stuff and things like that, but the vast majority of it is like actually kind of listenable if you can vibe into it just being sort of funky sounds. And then something like Fiona Apple album that came out last year. You know, people listen to that, and some people were like, man, that was really hard to listen to for some people. And you listen to it, and it's not as weird as the techniques used in the experimental stuff, but the sounds are actually further out in that album than they are on your typical bleepy, bloopy, scratchy synth kind of weird recording, because they are less weird. They're left more textured, and they're more uncomfortable. It's like oppressively, or the wall, for example, right? The sounds on the wall, especially the vinyl of the wall, are like oppressed. There's this like oppressive bass and this weird like uncomfortableness you get from it. But if you just program some like huge sounding synths and some gritty guitars on top of it, it's like not the same. It's like this very specifically.
Yes.
So sometimes, like you said, it's like to actually tuning like the way the measure of acceptability and where things sound good and sound kind of like things are clicking is oftentimes it's not as nearly as complicated as a concept as we think it is.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of times these people compare it, or generally speaking, think about it in terms of what they're used to or their reality that they base it on. It's like we can all kind of tell if we look at an image if the color is off from what we remember. So it's like, I think in a way maybe we're all just drawn to the idea of. I actually find your example about the reverb the most interesting, because this is such a fine detail, right? Like, oh, there's too much reverb.
Or it could go the other way. Everybody comes in and goes, it's okay. Well, how about if I add a little reverb to the vocal? That's it. You know, it wasn't specifically one way or the other, but just there's a, you know, whatever crosses the threshold of the whole band thinking it's good.
Yeah. I have a motto of sorts, a little audiophile and engineer motto, which is that most people have essentially good hearing, but they have untrained ears. And that's not necessarily like, learn how to hear certain frequencies or do this or that. It's just like your ears kind of get naturally, like, you know, when kids are playing with toys, they sort of are learning in a sort of gestalt, sort of primordial way, right? And in the same way, when we listen and we hear and we get more experienced about what music we like and what system qualities we like, we're learning and we're training our ears to hear certain things or paying attention to certain things. There's a direction, right? And there's a suggestions that are made by how we listen and the actual act of doing the audiophile or the engineer thing. It's training us. We're learning, and like you said, Dave, you know, as you do it, you hear stuff in the production where you go, oh, yeah, that clicks when you're first starting out. That you're like, oh, I'm gonna like make the drums all huge or whatever, and you get all focused on making the drums huge, and then the band comes in, they're like, this is supposed to be like a vocal album. Like, what the heck? Why did you make the drums huge?
Right,
It's like not important, you know. And that's just you just have to learn about those kind of things.
That makes me think of a pet peeve of mine with kind of old school audio reviewers and stuff. The whole thing of like Infinity Acoustics XL53s. I know they're accurate because, you know, I go to the concert hall once a week, and when I played the Sanson, blah, 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 the strings sound like, don't give me that bullshit. Unless, for one thing, the mic, the technique, the player, all that stuff is vastly more important. And not only that, but it's almost impossible, not impossible, but it's just, let me think how to say this. It's easier, for a speaker manufacturer to say, we have designed this to be accurate and reproduce the event, and it's easier for a reviewer to say, you know, I know what a Stradivarius sounds like, and these speakers made it sound exactly like what I remembered it sounded like in Symphony Hall in Boston. It's harder to say, or it seems like it's less committal for the speaker manufacturer to say, I can't possibly know what reality of the recording is because that doesn't really exist, so I'm just going to make them sound really good. That just sounds like a cop-out, but that's the reality. It sounds like a cop-out. That's what, and the reviewer should just say, well, I know what a violin sounds like. I go to see live concerts all the time, or I know what the band at my local pub sounds like, and if I'm truthful, the speakers playing this stuff back sounds nothing like what it sounds like when I'm in the concert hall or at the bar, but it sounds good. Violins are not screechy. They're not too dark. They have body. But anything beyond that, you're just bullshitting people.
Yeah. Any technical, like, oh, well, it measures flat within 1.5 dB or whatever, plus or minus between 20 and 20, is kind of the average consumer that their eyes glaze over, right? So it's like, that's one of the things I actually kind of appreciate about the hobby is that it's so hands-on, you know? I end almost all my reviews with like, well, I think this is something that you should put ears on, or I don't, really think this is something that necessarily you should put ears on. And that's just it. You're like, go hear it. Go to a show.
I can be a little guilty of that sometimes in reviews. Like I've said in the past, something like, when I listen to this amp or the speaker or whatever, and this Steven Wilson thing, that Rickenbacker with round wounds, it was so... I would be able to tell it was a Rickenbacker and round wounds in my car. Like I don't need that amp to tell me, just because I'm very familiar with that sound, and that kind of goes against what I just said. But in general,
you're not claiming it every time.
I'm not claiming it every time.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for coming on. Yeah, man, that's good. That's really good.
That was fun to dig into something that high level.
Yeah.
Where I don't know about you, Dave, but like that, when you brought that up, I actually like set my phone down. I sat down in a chair and I was like, fuck, I have to like really actually think about this. Like there's not too much in audiophile, hi-fi pro audio land that I have to like actually think about. And I had to sit down and like really consider it. And it was nice because I was like, I don't know exactly what I think about this. I know that I have reactions, but I need to like formulate some thoughts because this is a sticky, complicated, very high level minutia.
Well,
it's a difficult concept.
I mean, it only came about because it basically, in some ways, have kind of shattered my conventional thoughts of like, oh, ultra super accurate, super high res. I don't. That's not something I'm going to want to listen to much. And then, as time has gone on, and I've gotten those rare pieces of gear that do that, but also are in some kind of sweet spot of musicality. You're like, okay, I don't want to pick a certain kind of coloration. I really want it as clean as possible. So
it makes you believe in the magic again, like when you were a newbie.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like Peter Pan all over again.
Yeah. I mean, that giving,
holy shit.
That being said, I'm sure, 6 months from now, I get some 5-watt, zero feedback direct heated triad and be like, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it's like, it's totally inaccurate, but everything about it I love. This is it. So it's
Yeah.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and Audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.